Welcome back. You're still tuned in to News and Views with myself, Salailo Makwidire, and we're going to be kickstarting the show with a very, very important development. I think it was sometime earlier this week where the Hague group, I'm sure you've known about them for now, they were established, I think it was sometime last year, and essentially they came together for an emergency meeting on what's currently happening out in the Middle East, the concerning state of affairs and what we're seeing there, and also to, I think, unpack a bit what's happening in Gaza at this current moment. And we're going to be getting some insights on why that meeting took place ultimately, the discussions that have been had, and the outcomes that the various member countries of the Hague Group, the consensus that they've reached. And we're going to be jumping right into it. We'll be speaking to Executive Secretary of the Hague Group, Varsha. Gandikota. Varsha, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to News and Views. I really appreciate you giving us your time.
Good morning, Salelo. Thank you so much for having me.
No, the pleasure's all ours. And I'd like to jump right into it. You guys called for an emergency meeting of the Hague Group earlier this week. Can you give us a bit more insight on why this was, and why did you feel it was important to have that meeting, especially now looking at what's happening, especially in the Middle East?
Thank you. Yes, of course. The Hague Group was launched about exactly a year ago in January 2025, and it began in a very similar condition to what we're seeing now, which is conditions of complete impunity and complicity from countries across the world in blatant violations of international law in Gaza. That was in the middle of the Gaza genocide, and now, as we met yesterday, it's in the middle of accelerated annexation ambitions from the Israeli state, as we've seen from its incursions into the West Bank. It's the E1 tender project where we're all set to take over much more vast swaths of land, and highly increased instances of violations of settler violence against Palestinians, again in the occupied Palestinian territory. So it's in this context, and of course the military escalation in the Middle East and across the region, that the Hague Group met once again with a very clear twin imperative of cutting complicity and of ending impunity based on legal obligations that states already have, not just Israel and Palestine or states that are directly involved in the violence and the military escalation and incursions that we're seeing right now, but states across the world, from Europe to Latin America to Asia to Africa, legal obligations that states have to start enforcing measures across their own ports, courts, factories, and contracts.
No, very, very important to note that. I want to touch on, the group in itself. You mentioned that, it's a relatively new alliance formed in 2025. For our listeners who may be hearing about it for the first time, in the most simplest of forms, what is this coalition all about? And just looking at, some of the discussions that you guys had, in the earlier parts last year when it was formed, are there any success stories? Are there any, anything that you can look at and say this is a tangible kind of step that we took after we first met back in 2025 and formed the Hague Group?
Yes, absolutely. In its simplest form, the Hague Group is a forum for the defense of international law. Now, the fact that I have to say that, the fact that we had to found a new platform, a new forum to defend international law is in itself, of course, a tragedy, because that means our existing multilateral institutions like the ICC, like the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, and even the United Nations have been defanged and been made defunct, such that governments of conscience had to come together to, in an outside forum, stand up for and uphold and defend international law. In January 2025, it was about 8 countries from around the world that came together to form it with something extremely simple: no arms exports to Israel that could continue to make countries complicit in spilling the blood of Palestinians in this illegal war and illegal genocide. And second, no transfer of arms through any of the country's ports or allowing any vessels to use the flag of these countries to take military equipment or oil over to Israel. And third, a commitment once again to ensure accountability for Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, the two individuals who have arrest warrants issued against them. And we've seen this been successfully enforced. We've seen in Namibia, for example, a country right next to South Africa, where by shutting down its ports, it ensured that vessels like the Danica, which is a very specific vessel we know with evidence that used to use Namibian ports throughout the year of 2024 to transfer military equipment and oil over to Israel. And since Namibia's commitment to the Hague Group has no longer been allowed to dock at its ports. The same is true for Malaysia, which shut all its ports down for use for any transfer of equipment. And of course, we've also seen this with energy embargo from Colombia, which has completely blocked all coal exports to Israel over the last year since joining the Hague Group. Remember, this is important because it used to be one of the largest exporters of energy to Israel. And on accountability, once again, Netanyahu has not been able to use the airspace of any of the countries that made this commitment. And this is only expanding. They began with about 9 countries, but 13 more countries signed on to these measures in the Bogota Ministerial in July, including countries like Turkey, who have now shut down once again their airspace and their port space for transfers of military equipment over to Israel. And yesterday when we met, it was 40 countries in the room engaging in this discussion. So while all 40 countries have not yet signed on to these measures, they are engaging in a discussion which talks about how an urgent enforcement of these legal obligations of states.
Varsha, I want to take a quick break, but when we come back, I think I want to expand a bit on the last point that you made, international law and its enforcement, and how critical it is, especially now. But we'll unpack a bit later on after this.
For the first time, I can dream again.
The Africa Muslims Agency Orphan Hope Program provides the food, clothing, and basic support needed by thousands of children across the world. Every child deserves a chance at a hopeful future.
For 50,000 trans, you can transform our lives with the AMA Orphan Hope Program.
Africa Muslims Agency, empowering, educating, inspiring.
You know, it's a wonder how kids get anything done these days. With all the distractions, when do they even get time to study? As a mother, all I can really do is make sure they have all they need to perform at their best. That's why I choose to include Sunfoil, triple refined pure sunflower oil with every meal I make. Naturally cholesterol-free and approved by the Heart and Stroke Foundation as part of a balanced eating plan. So whether I'm cooking, frying, or baking, I know every dish will be a wholesome one. Sunfoil, now we're cooking.
Discover the Africa of your dreams and surround yourself with her spectacular beauty. Relax beneath her serene sunsets and explore wildlife at its natural best. It's where the pride of Africa comes together. The Kwantu Private Game Reserve. Get to know the Big Five or cruise on an elephant safari game drive. Interact with lion and tiger cubs and enjoy world-class halal cuisine while we pamper you during your 5-star stay. Indulge in the true African experience. For reservations, call now on 042-203-1400 or visit kwantu.co.za. The Kwantu Private Game Reserve, the place of gathering.
Freedom Stationery supply Marlin and Marlin Kids pens to me and my school friends. They supply just about everything we need to help us get a better education, from books to files to rulers. In fact, any any accessory we need. Freedom Stationery. Education for the nation. What does accessory mean?
With Ashraful Aid this Ramadan, your zakat changes lives. It feeds families facing hunger, restores dignity to those in need, and brings hope where it is needed most. From food relief to essential support, your zakah reaches communities with care, transparency, and impact. Give with confidence, give with trust. Make your zakah count this Ramadan. Give your zakah to Ashraful Aid and help change lives today.
You are listening to Salam Media live from our headquarters in South Africa. This is Salam Media, keeping you company this Ramadan.
Welcome back. You're still tuned in to News and Views of myself, Salailo Makwidiri. We're still in conversation with the Executive Secretary of the Hague Group, Varsha Gandikota. And we're getting a bit more insight on the group itself, some of the work that they've been doing, being formed in 2025. And also just understanding, I think we'll touch on this later, this emergency meeting and what's at its core. But Varsha, before we went for that ad break, I wanted to touch briefly on international law and enforcement, which I think is one of the core ideas behind the Hague Group, behind you guys' initiative. And it's all about enforcing rulings from organizations like the International Court of Justice. Practically speaking, how can countries, how can states translate the legal findings into, real world pressure and accountability, which is something that I think there's been a disillusionment from people all across the world. We always see rulings from the ICJ and from other bodies similar to it, but they never translate to actions on the ground.
Thank you, Salilo. If I can be honest, I think that disillusionment is felt by diplomats too. That disillusionment is felt by bureaucrats inside foreign ministries too, because they are the ones, many of them in governments, working on winning these rulings from the international courts, from the United Nations, only to see many of their fellow nations blatantly disregard them once they're signed onto the paper, making international law essentially not worth the paper that it's written on. So while we cannot fix the entire system, there are obligations that states can already start enforcing within their own national jurisdictions. So if you look at the charter of the Hague Group, at our very core is the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion on Israel's unlawful occupation in the occupied Palestinian territories of July 2024. 124 countries signed on to all of these list of obligations in the United Nations General Assembly in September. Now, these obligations range from asset freezes and visa bans to sanctions, to cutting off of trade, to ensuring no access to ports, to ensuring no access to airspace. It's a really long list of legal obligations that all nations are subject to. And these are not about enforcement in some other far off multilateral space that's inaccessible, but in each country's own courts, in each country's own ports, and through their own industry and through their own trade. That's precisely why we believe that enforcement can already begin without being stonewalled or without being held up by, say, vetoes in the United Nations Security Council. And that's precisely what we'd like to model, which is a coordinated enforcement of our legal obligations. And I'll say one more thing here. What's important is that we do it collectively. Because while there is an appetite to act, it's also true that we have seen punishments come down on countries that have stood with Palestine. South Africa is, of course, a tremendous example of this, who have been repeatedly punished by Washington and also by certain European nations for their stance on Palestine's steadfast commitment to Palestine. And we've seen this with other states like Colombia. We've seen this with states like Spain, who are now once again facing the brunt in a battle with President Donald Trump. The only antidote to this kind of a unilateral punishment wielded by powerful states is for all of the other states to stand together collectively and coordinate their enforcement, which also has a practical element to it. If we are keen and really serious about cutting off the material arteries, cutting off the supply chains, then we need to be able to coordinate across the supply chain of the military supply, which means Angola being in conversation with Namibia, Namibia being in conversation with South Africa being in conversation with India. And that's the only way we will truly be able to ensure that our land and our labor is not being used to spill the blood of Palestinians.
I want to touch on the point that you make in Global South diplomacy, because many member states of the Hague Group come from the Global South, as you mentioned. Do you see this as part of a broader shift when it comes to global diplomacy, where countries outside the traditional, Western blocs are shaping the legal response to international conflicts and some of the atrocities that we see occur all across the world?
Absolutely. I would say that the Hague Group is led by Global South countries. It's co-chaired by Colombia and South Africa, which is quite unique, as you've rightly pointed out, in terms of these very big and broad global blocs that we see, which are routinely held by nations of the West. However, what's even more incredible is that it has now grown to engage many, many more European nations than it did when it first began. So if you look at the member states attending the meeting 2 days ago in The Hague, of the 40-member contingent was the largest European nations contingent to ever participate in a Hague Group meeting. And we've also seen geopolitically that several countries in Europe, Spain included, Norway, for example, Slovenia, have actually taken much greater measures than even many other countries in the global south to fulfill their obligations in the defense of international law. So there's a leadership element to this, which is certainly unique to the global south. And I think that stems from the fact, very well articulated in the launch op-ed written by the three presidents from Malaysia, South Africa, and Colombia, Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, President Ramaphosa, and President Petro, where they say, we see what's happening in Palestine, and it echoes dark chapters of each of our own histories. The military dictatorship in Colombia, apartheid regime in South Africa, and the colonial regime in Malaysia. And we know and recognize what we are seeing, and we will not let that happen again. So that's certainly a clear motivating line for many global South states, but it's incredible to see that their leadership is now being able to bring forth European nations and a broad swath of global North nations to come together in the defense of law.
I want to come back to the emergency meeting. We've seen developments coming out of the Middle East, the Iran-Israeli war, if I can put it that way. How much of it was, one of the factors that prompted this meeting, and how much did that war feature, this current conflict that we're seeing out in the Middle East affecting some of the Gulf countries? Was it central to the meeting and the conversations that you guys were having there?
This meeting was about Palestine. This meeting was about accountability for the genocide. This meeting was about the enforcement of international law in the occupied Palestinian territories. Having said that, it is clear to everyone involved, and even those in the room, that impunity breeds impunity. We have seen that what Israel has been allowed to do with its genocide in Gaza over the last 2 years has certainly fueled its ambitions and has certainly given it a green signal that no matter what it does, it can get away without any consequence. No matter the violations of international law, nobody will be able to stop it. And this applies not just to its annexation ambitions inside the West Bank and the occupied Palestinian territories, as we've seen in the last month, but certainly also for its ambitions of greater Israel in the region. And so this is something that's clear to all of us. But the concrete measures that were proposed, deliberated, and discussed were in relation to Palestine, and the three that you've seen come out in the co-chair statement on screening for Israeli travelers that have committed war crimes at all our ports of entry using a self-declaration form, forcing travelers to disclose essentially their service in the IDF and service in the Israeli military, so that we can track and ensure that perpetrators of war crimes, perpetrators of crimes of genocide, perpetrators of crimes against humanitarian law are not allowed to enter each of our own countries. And second, to ensure non-recognition of settlements, which are expanding as we speak, and ensure that we do not entrench or support these occupations by, for example, importing products from settlement areas. And third, cutting our own complicity, measures that we've discussed throughout this show, things such as reviewing public contracts to ensure public financing, our own people's taxpayers' money, does not go towards contracts in the occupied territories, and cutting complicity across ports and airspaces.
Finally, before I let you go, Varsha, what would success look like for the Hague Group in the months ahead? And what's top of the agenda right now? If there could be 2, maybe 3 things that you say are top of the agenda that the Hague Group is looking at with emergency, what would those be?
So Lelo, I'd say the success of the Hague, the long-term success of the Hague Group, is that it should not exist anymore. I repeat that I think it's a tragedy that we had to come and form a group, because it really does point to how many nations have defanged our existing global international institutions. And we hope that the Hague Group will act as a push, as a reminder, and as a nudge for all nations to return to give international law teeth again, and so that it's not left as just a letter on a page that does not have any relation to social reality and geopolitical conditions. So that, I would say, is really the long-term success of the Hague Group, when we are made redundant by the emboldening of our existing institutions. In the short term, we are focused on the 3 measures that we have shortlisted in this week's meeting, and there is a ministerial that we are going to hold, inviting all countries of the world to participate in the upcoming weeks, likely at the end of April, where we hope that we will see a wide-scale adoption of the accountability measures discussed, including especially the immigration directive or the accountability screening directive for all Israeli war criminals.
There we go. Varsha Gandikota, Executive Secretary of the Hague Group. Thank you so much for chatting to us. Really appreciate you giving us your time, and hope we chat again soon.
Thank you for having me.
There you go. And with that, we've come to the end of this segment. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, News and Views continues.